Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another in our Inside Coach Education, Player Education Masterclass conversations. Today, absolutely delighted to be joined by Mr. John Galluci Jr. John is the president of Jag1 Physical Therapy and also the medical coordinator for MLS Soccer. So somebody that we're incredibly fortunate to have sharing his time with us today. So for the benefit of coaches and players alike, obviously as we turn our attentions to hopefully exiting the lockdown period that we find ourselves in, John's here to share some very important advice for how we can limit injuries on the return to play. Obviously, I have Mr. Mark Wilson alongside me, Tom Shields, and thank you players and coaches that are on the line for joining us now, or those that are tuning in on demand. We always appreciate you choosing Beyond Pulse as your daily source of education. So, John, without me doing an injustice to your background and your very esteemed history in the game, if you could please just provide the listeners with a quick intro to you and why obviously we're so excited to have you on the line with us today.
Well, Tom, thank you so much. It's really appreciated that you guys have given us an opportunity to come online and speak to some coaches and players. So thank you for that. A little bit of my history and background. I'm a licensed physical therapist and also a licensed athletic trainer. Been in professional sports and sports for the last 35 years of my career as an athletic trainer and physical therapist. In the last 21 years, I've had the opportunity to work very specific to the sport of soccer, originally starting as a head athletic trainer and rehab coordinator for the Metro Stars, which became Red Bull. And then about 16 years ago, assumed the position for Major League Soccer as the medical coordinator, and most recently changed my job title in Major League Soccer to the assistant to the chief medical officer. And the role there is assisting in mitigating risk and liability and rolling out policies and procedures for health and safety throughout the entire league. Besides that, I am the president, CEO, and founder of Jag1 Physical Therapy, which has 64 locations throughout New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, offering physical therapy care for athletes and our general population. And also, we also own one of the largest athletic training service businesses throughout the tri-state area as well, which many soccer clubs utilize throughout the tri-state area.
Yeah, thank you for that. And obviously, it's an incredibly dense resume, and one that's obviously been blessed with seeing.
It's either dense or I'm old, so it's one or the other.
We'll go with dense. We'll feel generous. No, look, John. Obviously, your experiences are quite remarkable, and your place in the game, and the experiences that you've had have been fantastic. So obviously, we really do thank you for taking the time out today to share your time with us. Yeah, John, thank you for the insight into your background. Obviously, those joining us from New Jersey will be very familiar with the Jag1 physical therapy services. So obviously, we thank you for all the great care and attention that you give to all the players that come into contact with the organization. John, obviously, we wanted to pick your brains a little bit today about advice and guidance both to players and coaches surrounding what they can be doing to make sure that when we do get back to the field after this, long and unfortunate kind of lockdown situation that we find ourselves in right now, that we try to limit any potential injuries that we see. So just want to start here in understanding that the players will not be coming back to the field football fit or soccer ready. Could you provide any insight or guidance as to what they could be doing, right now while they are in lockdown, just to try to limit the impacts of what returning to play might look like on their bodies? How could they best prepare for that?
Sure. So I think it's important to point out that all of our athletes, no matter what sport, but more specifically soccer, which is a high endurance sport, Yeah, we truly understand in the last 8 to 12 weeks, depending upon what part of the country you lived in with the stay-at-home orders, it has been very difficult to keep up your endurance, your strength. One of the things that we all hope as coaches and physical therapists, athletic trainers, directors in the game, and players is that people at least kept up with their core activities. So core is very important to the sport of soccer, as we know. Soccer being a very heavy rotational sport and ultimately being a high endurance sport. Every athlete depends on the core, but a soccer player really depends on the strength and stamina of their core. And there's many different programs that athletes can be doing at home to maintain that strength and flexibility of the core. And the reason why we focus on making sure, even at home, is when we do go back to the pitch and we start to work out, most people will notice between low back soreness, abdominal soreness, hip flexor soreness, is really because you didn't maintain any type of flexibility, endurance, and strength of your core. So it's very important. And then overview, the stronger your core, the better it is to decrease the incidence of injuries of your extremities. The second thing that we have to be concerned about, definitely about people going back to the pitch. I mean, we're all hoping and praying, depending upon the part of the country you live in, that by June 1, we can all be back on the pitch and doing some sort of either individual, small-sided, and maybe in some parts of the country actually getting some bigger field play in. But ultimately, as we've seen on the digital space and announcements in the last week, Major League Soccer returned with a concept of individual training. There's no reason in certain states right now that have lifted their stay-at-home orders that our youth soccer players, our club soccer players, our high school, college soccer players can get out and start to do some endurance running, get their legs underneath them again, and start to build up some stamina again, which is very important. But more importantly, start to do some directional work, some cone work, some cutting work. Everybody wants to run to do ball work. I think it's important we build a pace. Think about it. When we look at a soccer season, it's really taken over the entire year. If you're a club soccer player, you're really training all year round. We never had a situation that you've been shut down pretty much from being on the pitch for more maybe than 2 weeks, 3 weeks to a year. And now we've had people that have been 8 to 12 weeks shut down from the pitch. So our advice has been, and my advice has been, let's get our legs underneath us. Let's start open some small runs, opening up into longer runs, starting to time yourself, building up your endurance, starting out with maybe 30 minutes, and over a week to 2 weeks time, building up those endurance activities, those cuts, those directional runs for a 45-minute hour period. As we know, the game of soccer is played in a 90-minute situation. And ultimately, if you've done nothing for 8 to 12 weeks, it's going to be very hard for you to pick up and go 90 minutes. So to decrease the incidence of strains of the muscles, you've got to realize there's a lot of factors that go into it. You know, coaches, I love you all, but everybody thinks, oh, you're young, 15, 16 years old, get on the pitch and let's go for an hour. You've got to understand, people have not been eating and there's been poor nutrition. There's been definitely a consistency of poor hydration, especially when you increase activity. So I think it's very important that any coach try to guide their participants back for a 30 to 45-minute just conditioning overview with fantastic hydration, water, non-sugar sports drinks or partial sugar sports drinks, making sure we stay away from the high sugar that everybody's been home eating and trying to get back into some sort of nutritional habits. As we all know as coaches, exercise physiologists, one of the major factors that cause muscle strains, fatigue. Many people have been having sleeping issues. Too much too soon. The muscle fatigues and gets burned out quickly, overemphasizes and ultimately leads to a fatigue strain. Hydration issues lead to a fatigue strain, and poor nutrition ultimately lead to that type of strain as well. So those are factors that we can definitively do as we're ramping back up in these individual workouts to decrease that possibility of strain. The other thing I think it's important we bring back is flexibility. You guys haven't done anything for 8 weeks. Maybe you did some core work next to your couch, but now you're back on the field. Let's bring back some full range of motion activities and making sure that we're flexible to handle it. Last thing, and listen, although Jag 1 physical therapy, as you can imagine, needs the business, after the last 8 to 12 weeks, we don't want people off the pitch if they can stay on the pitch. So let's stay healthy and do this the right way with a good progression back to full field play.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think it's so important, some of what you have said there, just regarding Mark. We've spent the last 2 months talking about factors that players can control, and I think, John, a lot of what you echoed there is the willingness to do the right thing in preparing for play, so that obviously once you do get the opportunity to be back out on the field, your body is as ready as possible. If we fuel it incorrectly, if we don't give it the chance to recharge, if we don't give it the chance to recover, obviously we're going to be in a situation where we've waited 2.5 months to get back out there, and then all of a sudden we'll be back sat at home staring at 4 walls, but when everybody else will be playing. So players, I hope
just to bring that all in, just for you real quick, if you look at New York and New Jersey in the last week, they opened up the parks. Yeah. And ultimately on Monday, so the parks were open Friday, Saturday, Sunday in New York, and Saturday, Sunday in New Jersey. On Monday and Tuesday, we had some weekend warriors and youth, athletes that went out Saturday and Sunday and did a little too much too quick. And ultimately our census of muscle strains and delayed onset muscle soreness really ravaged the call centers for our clinics for people that were sore because they went from nothing to too much. And then we had the great problem that the weather was beautiful here in New York and New Jersey. So ultimately, we as coaches, performance people, physical therapists, and athletic trainers really want to have that progression going. And we saw it just this weekend. So.
Right. And I think it's so important, speaking to the coaches and perhaps some of the parents that might be listening, and directly to the players that are so eager to be out there, but that we have to be patient, right? We can't go from 0 to 100. It's kind of common sense to make sure that we do taper return to play activities in such a way that, obviously, as we said, we're avoiding those overuse or strain injuries that might become so apparent. So players, obviously, John just spoke there to the importance of sleeping, to the importance of hydration, to the importance of getting some stretching, some flexibility work done prior to performance, and obviously trying to recover the best way you possibly can. And John, we'll go into that concept as we build through this conversation a little bit more. What I did want to talk about, and maybe it'll be specific to the next kind of few months, but what are the most common forms of injury that you see in youth soccer players, and what advice could you share to both the players, parents, and coaches listening to try to limit this? So obviously, as we return, and then importantly thereafter as well, we don't want to just start to use best practice for the next month and then forget about it. So if you could if you share something there, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, you've got to understand, I've been my time as a professional in soccer over the last 21 years has really been able to be around some of the greatest soccer medicine minds, some of soccer performance minds across the world, from Europe to Asia to the United States, and comparing notes. And we all have a commonality as professionals that we've all agreed upon. When you look at youth soccer, we all have an agreement that the injuries that we're seeing most of can truly be deterred by true direction of conditioning and appropriate conditioning. And the biggest injuries that we see in youth soccer is a component of soft tissue injury strains. Now, of course, your collision injuries are a common thing in soccer. But when you look at a youth player, anywhere between the ages of 12 to to 18, 19 years old, and they're dealing with groin strains, quad strains, low back strains, hamstring strains, calf strains. When you're a physical therapist athletic trainer around the game for so long, you sit there and say to yourself, well, what truly happened? Was it the athlete playing through something and didn't report it and didn't treat it? Or was it a coach that maybe, didn't have a true protocol of progression in a preseason component? Or was it a nutritional or hydration factor that maybe the child or the athlete couldn't get good advice on good nutrition and hydration? And that's what led me to write my book, Soccer Injury Prevention and Treatment, that came out about 4 years ago. And ultimately, what we've seen is coaches now and parents are truly invested in this concept of progression of conditioning. And that's why the sport has had the ebb and flow throughout a year and a season of truly what to identify. So our preseason concept, coaches used to look at, we're going to have 2 and 3 a days during preseason. And now coaches have really taken a step back and said, well, we may have 2 practices in the day, but there's going to be a conditioning component and a game education component. And ultimately, we've seen that really throughout the country in youth soccer really start to take off, that coaches are really identifying that conditioning. And what are you doing during conditioning? It used to be a component that if you go back 10 years ago, it used to be, all right, we're going to run for an hour. Well, now we have coaches that have really gone into soccer-specific function, have gone into a strengthening component. So it's no longer we're going to run 7 miles. It's we're going to do an endurance component, a strengthening component, a multi-directional component. And as we know, research has shown us, multi-directional athletes are injured at a much less rate, and their injuries are not as long in the rehab component. That's why so many sports medicine specialists like myself push for multi-sport athletes, because that multi-directional training for the multi-sports decreases the incidence of injuries. So ultimately, if you put all that together with the common sense of the parents and coaches truly having this progression of training and bringing athletes back in a good fashion, ultimately will decrease the incidence of those strains and strains. To answer the question directly, in soccer, especially youth soccer, you see overuse injuries in the hip and groin, and you see overuse in the patella tendon and the quadriceps, and you see a lot of calf strains that maybe with the appropriate training regimen you wouldn't see. As far as collision, the most highest injuries you see in soccer is definitely contusions of quad contusions and shin contusions, and of course the most common is sprained ankles and knee sprains. Usually your MCL of your knee and a normal inversion sprain of your ankle. So those are the highest incident, but we could really mitigate the injuries and going to get treatment if we really appropriately conditioned our athletes and made sure nutrition and hydration and rest were factors in a preseason component.
Yeah, it's brilliant advice, John, and I just as a little segue, you've mentioned their overuse injuries, and the importance of multi-sport athletes being, having a greater propensity for multi-directional movement and a capability to perform, a broader range of movements without injury. Could you speak just, obviously this is a heavy soccer-centric call, but could you speak, maybe directly to both players and parents and coaches as to understanding the benefits of what multi-sport engagement and participation would give you up to a certain age, and perhaps why, if a player's primary focus is on soccer and soccer only at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, how their bodies will develop maybe a little more limited, and
Sure.
that those would be exposed to a broader range of movements through other sports.
Absolutely. So ultimately, again, when you look at developing a youth soccer player and you're looking at the ages of 10 to 14 years old, if you isolate one directional movement each and every day, being your hip flexor and your hip adductor, most often what will happen is there'll be a component that muscle becomes tighter and stronger than your extensors and your abductors. And ultimately, if you're not being trained by a high level performance coach that understands the factors of the multi-directional component of the hip, you're not going to get the flexibility and strength components of all the multi-directions of your hip. So the biggest issue we see in youth soccer is definitively that tightness in your flexors and your adductors, and that weakness in your abductors and your extensors. And usually in youth soccer, especially if you're playing 8 to 9 months, sometimes 10 months a year at a club level or an academy level, we actually see too much of an incidence of what we call apophyseal fractures, which is the tendon pulls the bone off of the bone. So the tendon is attached to the bone and pulls a little piece of the bone off, which ultimately means this athlete now between 10 to 14 years old has to be completely shut down, and nobody wants that. A tremendous amount of performance coaches, which usually are not introduced to these athletes until they're 14 above, playing at a high academy or club level, usually you can't get a really good educated performance coach in that 10 to 14 range unless the kid happens to be part of a really strong club. So what happens is the parents become the performance coach in understanding that their child should be trained in a multi-directional fashion. And most parents don't understand that and are hard pressed to find someone that's going to condition their 10 to 14-year-old. So ultimately, the easiest way to combat it is let your child play multi-directional sports. But usually when you're looking at a soccer player at those ages, you'll really see these athletes playing something like lacrosse in the spring or football in the fall or wrestling in the winter, depending upon their involvement in soccer. And ultimately, they do get that multi-directionally strengthening flexibility from those sports. Of course, many soccer coaches don't want to hear anything about football because it's during the fall season, and here in the Northeast, as we know in the high schools, that's when soccer is played. Ultimately, it's very, very important that on those off-seasonal in the high school level, you let the athlete play those other sports. But again, performance coaches have become so educated that they are including. So if you look at our athletes in Major League Soccer and you look at athletes in the USL, their performance coaches right now train them in a multi-directional level so they actually stay out of our training rooms and don't get these overuse injuries. But the easiest way to combat it in the youth level is truly let the athlete play two sports throughout the season, throughout the year, or make sure that they're working with someone that understands it. And the biggest thing that we are seeing are these hip injuries. And there's nothing worse than telling a 12-year-old he can't do anything for 6 months. And his pain will go away in 2 to 3 weeks. But because of this fracture, because of this tightness of tissue, the athlete really has to go through a rehab component of 8 weeks of healing of that bone, and then 8 weeks of flexibility and strengthening of the entire hip. And then ultimately, think about it, at least 4 weeks of back to soccer conditioning. And you add all that up, nobody wants to take that much time off from the pitch. So I think it's easier prevention leads us to staying on the pitch. So I think parents and coaches are really starting to buy into this multi-directional strengthening, flexibility, and making sure that we're not overloading the factors that I mentioned.
Yeah, and I think it's so important, and perhaps speaking to the coaches, John, the ability to, at the youngest ages, the formative ages, 7, 8, I guess the window of opportunity for learning, 7, 8 to kind of 11 and 12, that maybe the use of, non-soccer activities within soccer for 30 minutes a week could also be helpful, right? Like there's, you know, maybe trying to integrate a game of handball or a game of, you know, movement games, tag, something like that, that, you know, might not be specifically associated to, you know, directly to soccer, but the, you know, the transferability of movement skills and things like that to ultimately prevent from future injuries being seen would be helpful. Willow, you start to turn your mic on, mate. I don't mean to.
Yeah, I mean, I love the content and what's being delivered, John. And it's, for me, it's critically important. I had the good fortune or misfortune to have 16 seasons, pre-seasons at a professional level. And when I think about just circling back to muscle soreness, obviously you play a full season and then we would stop around May 10th to 15th and restart again maybe July 8th. So after a long season, obviously as a player, if you've played that long, you take a couple of weeks, but then you start to gradually build yourself back up. Now for players listening, are there any measurables in terms of muscle soreness when you start to come back into activity? Should there be any muscle soreness? Is there a scale that you can recommend to players that they need to abide by, so yes, a little bit of muscle soreness is okay, I can keep going, or, you know, when it starts to feel like this, or at 8 out of 10, you should start to dial back on the exercises you're actually doing?
So that's a great question, and as we identified through research and physiology, we actually came up with this concept of DOMS, which is known as delayed onset muscle soreness. And usually what it is you've worked really hard one day and the muscle gets engorged with blood flow, lactic acid, and becomes stiff, rigid, and painful. Ultimately, most people, when they feel that, stop doing everything. And that's actually not the appropriate thing to do. But you shouldn't go back to the same workout you did the day before. So usually we tell people that do get delayed onset muscle soreness within 24 to 48 hours of a hard workout, that they should actually warm up on the stationary bike or go for a light jog for about 15, 20 minutes, and then do a very light stretch. And they'll notice that 50% resolve of that delayed onset muscle soreness and stiffness and pain will be gone. So that's how we deal with DOMS. The other advice I would give the players is learn your body. Understand what is pain, what is soreness. So if you've sprained an ankle, that's pain. And ultimately understand that there's a pain scale. We in the medical world use a pain scale of 0 to 10. When you originally sprain an ankle, you're like an 8. You're an 8 out of 10. When you walk on that ankle, you're an 8 out of 10. When you have muscle soreness, you're really looking at a 2 or a 3. So we usually tell our youth athletes, we tell our professional athletes, we tell all athletes that if you use the pain scale of 0 out of 10 and you're creeping to a 5, 6 out of 10, you need to get some advice from a medical professional. You need to share with somebody if you're a 5, 6 out of 10. Because if you're a 5, 6 out of 10 and you're creeping towards the 7, 8, you've truly sustained an injury. If you're at a 24-hour period and you're in that 5, 6 range, you're truly sustained an injury and should get advice. And again, you can join us at info@jag1pt.com. It's free advice. We'll give you the advice right over the internet and say, hey, you need to do this. But more importantly, if you're below that 5, what are you doing for yourself? And again, that's where that delayed onset muscle soreness. Usually people will have a 4 or 5 soreness after that hard workout. And that resume of what I told you, the next day, get the body warmed up, get the circulation going, get some good stretching, some range of motion, some functional range of motion exercises, and you'll see a 50% resolve where your 4 out of 5 will drop to a 1 or a 2, and that's important. But again, the best safety thing I could tell all of you, 0 out of 10, if you're creeping a 5, 6, you need to reach out to a medical professional. And as I said, here at Jag1 Physical Therapy, we've done a great job on answering questions on the internet for our info@jag1pt.com. And again, you guys have access to me. I know Tom and Mark know how to get me directly. I talk to anybody. I'm available 24/7. I don't charge anybody. It drives my executives crazy and my wife crazy. My opinion is I've got the wealth of knowledge. Let me give it. So if I could keep somebody on the pitch, I'd rather you be on the pitch than in my office.
Thank you, John. That's wonderful, and yeah, certainly we can attest to both the expertise and the giving nature that you have. So I want to just blend what Willow mentioned, John, to kind of the next question more broadly on the importance of recovery strategies. I think often coaches can emphasize the importance of a warm-up, but then perhaps forget sometimes the cool down. Coaches that are running between games, or players, families that are going to their third game of the day from a multi-child family that has to run off. So can you please just run off after a game is finished? Can you speak to the importance of what regen and recovery strategies should look like, maybe after a regular game, maybe at a tournament, and at what age they should really become very important based upon the physical development that you're seeing within athletes?
Sure. So first of all, and I'm going to show my age a little bit here. So when I started my career, I came out of school, went right to work for New York University's athletic department, then jumped to Columbia University, and also was working for the New York Knicks, the legendary Mike Saunders, who was a physical therapist, athletic trainer for years. And it was interesting. I come out of school with all this information, and you just want to give it. And I was under the tutelage of two great head athletic trainers and Mike Saunders early in my career, John Eckel and Jim Gossett. Jimmy is still at Columbia University. And ultimately, when you look at the concept of regeneration, we as medical professionals used to pull our hair out, not understanding why coaches and strength and conditioning coaches, which was the title 25 years ago, and now it's become performance coach, really didn't give kids an opportunity to really cool down, to really get their heart rate down, to get some range of motion, making sure they get rid of tightness, making sure that they're good after a game, a practice, and really taking that time. Most importantly, during regeneration, again, to hydrate appropriately. Because we know in youth sports, it's to drop up, to pick up, and you go. There's no reason why when you get home, you can't go through a little bit of regeneration and flexibility and hydration to put in your protocol. As we evolved at the New York Knicks under the great Greg Britnam, who was our strength and conditioning coach, we always believed in a component of regeneration, and that's 25 years ago. And ultimately, when I went on to the Metro Stars Red Bulls, I actually sat with our performance coach, and you guys will know his name. His name is Juan Carlos Osorio, who's had a great career throughout the world. I mean, he's coached in England, he's coached in South America, he's coached in Major League Soccer. And I sat down with Juan Carlos, who was a young strength and conditioning coach, and now he is a national team coaching. But I sat down with the youngster and I said, why don't we do any type of regeneration? Why are we done with practice and it's the showers and the cars? And he actually enveloped it into his protocol. And ultimately, he was one of the first strength and conditioning coaches in Major League Soccer to bring this process. And then Bob Bradley brought it to Chicago, and of course, everywhere he's gone. And Bob has definitely read the physiological components of regeneration. We've seen it come to academy level and club level, but still our youth programs still have that drop-off mentality. Practice is over. Coaches, you got to add the 10 minutes in your practice. You've got to put into a portion of your practice that it's a good way of, hey, it's great for teamwork to have everybody get together and come down afterwards. But it's also a great way to really get to know your body, come down off of the training, get the range of motion, get the hydration. And it's a great team relationship program. So it's both great physiological studies show it's great. So ultimately, I think we need to put it in every level of athletics. And the youth level has been adopting it in the last 5 years. It needs to be even more and more. My son is a very high-level lacrosse player and a high-level fencer. He fences across the country. He's fenced internationally. He's fenced for the Junior Olympics. And ultimately, his coaches have implemented regeneration at all the levels, from his recreation levels to his club levels. We need to really adopt it. It's very important for the body to really get a good set after training.
Is there an age, John, that you would say it becomes critical? So obviously,
I'm a development. That's a great question. I'm a development guy. My opinion is we're teaching the sport. We're teaching any level of conditioning. We need to teach the athlete how to take care of themselves. And usually you see a fundamental education component kick in between 10, 11, 12 years old. And we're giving them tools for their entire career. Mark referenced his career, and he referenced his 16 years. The platform of what people gave him over those 16 years, he took out his career. So why aren't we giving 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds a base and foundation, not just about the sport, the education, but really how to take care of themselves? And it's not just conditioning, flexibility, and strengthening and core. It's nutrition and hydration. Let's start at 10, 11, 12 years old and give them the same foundation that Mark had of the privilege of professionals, and truly give them the same base. Again, as I said, keep them on the pitch. Isn't that our goal? Keeping our athletes on the pitch. And this is the best way to do it.
John, I couldn't agree more. And when I think about, I've had two major injuries in my career: a snapped Achilles, and you referenced earlier, I avulsed the piece of bone off my hip. And that was between the age of 20 and 22. So it happened in a really short space of time, something we can probably discuss offline. I'll be intrigued by your answers. But for players listening out there, the reason I was able to carve out probably another 6 or 7 years post 25 was because of working with individuals like John, and working with strength and conditioning coaches, working with sports physiotherapists, and understanding why and how to do, certainly to regenerate properly, certainly to prevent rather than cure. This is certainly one of the most valuable pieces of you having a career, and making sure you can be out on the field practicing and training and playing all the time. Don't undervalue, and I know we're 38 minutes in, but as all of this information is coming in for the players and coaches on the line, this is really a critical piece of your process every single day. So just wanted to reinforce that as having the experience of working through it, and the big reason why I was able to carry on playing late on in my career, despite a couple of really serious injuries.
Yeah, thanks, Willow. Just while we're on the subject of injuries, it's a nice segue. Obviously, overcoming injuries at any stage of your career, but specifically to young players who perhaps, might want to rush back, might have increased frustration, might feel like they're missing out. Could you speak, and I know, John, you kind of touched upon it a little bit briefly with, the concept of, hey, we might be out for 6 months and this is why, but can you speak just more kind of clearly to the negative implications of rushing back and returning to play? Obviously, the barriers of, hey, I'm out for 2 weeks, and if that 2 weeks becomes 3 days, then actually the 2 week could now become 3 months, and the patience in that process is obviously, critical to avoid future injury. So if you could just speak to it, appreciating that it is a part of the game, and it's something that everybody ultimately has to go through at some point in their career.
Sure. So understand that rehab has a process, and there's a physiological process that many coaches and parents really don't understand. So first and foremost, any injury that's immobilized, so an ankle injury, a knee injury, you got to understand, if that's immobilized, your body, your musculature starts to atrophy and weaken within 24 hours of immobilization. So if you're in a boot for an ankle injury, a foot injury, a step injury, or a knee brace for a knee injury, you've got to understand that within the first 24 hours, the muscle is weakened and gets small. and that's on one side that the muscle. So think about your body working biomechanically. One side of your body now has decreased in muscle size and decreased in muscle strength. Most often, an orthopedic is going to put you in some sort of apparatus for anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks, if it's a fracture, if it's a tear, or whatever, for 4 to 6 weeks. So ultimately, you usually see a muscle mass increase by close to 3 to 6 centimeters, depending upon the mass we're talking about. So if the muscle is decreased in size by that much, think about the level of endurance and strength that we've lost. And physiologically, again, research has showed us it takes really 6 weeks of conditioning to truly gain muscle strength. So if we put those things together and you technically sprained the muscle or torn a tendon and you've been immobilized, and you know for a fact you come out of this apparatus after 4 to 6 weeks, and we know strength doesn't really come back physiologically and size for about 6 weeks, well, we know right there is a 10 to 12 week process. So everybody likes to say, hey, I'm out of the boot, I'm ready to go. And usually those are the people that end up going back in the boot or back in the brace. So we've got to take a plan. Now, ankle sprains should definitely be treated differently. Some of the older style physicians believe in immobilization. Research has shown us in a first and second degree ankle sprain, you should actually be right into PT within 24 hours of injury. So our research has shown and evolved us to a point that an ankle sprain, a first degree ankle sprain, should really keep you off the pitch for maybe 2 weeks if it's treated appropriately. A second degree ankle sprain should maybe keep you off the pitch for 4 to 6 weeks if it's treated appropriately. A third degree, a little different, it's a full tear. You're going to possibly need surgery and immobilization for a longer period of time. So research is a big factor in a lot of things we found out in the last 5, 8 to 10 years as it comes to certain injuries. But if we talk globally about every injury, we have to understand there is a process. There's a process of healing. There's a process of strength. There's a process of range of motion. There's a process of function. And then there's a process of return to sport. And until those processes are followed, you can't really be expected to go out on the pitch for 90 minutes and play a full game. Now, everybody is different. Everybody heals differently. Everybody recovers differently. And everybody's not honest differently. You've got to be honest with yourself. And if you're in physical therapy, you can't expect to go from the physical therapy table doing exercises for 45 minutes to playing a 90-minute game. You're just tricking yourself. You have to understand that it's from the physical therapy table. Now, luckily, a lot of the JAG 1 physical therapy centers have functional space that we can put the functional part into the rehab, so our athletes get that functional part with us. But then there's the return to sport, which we work with the coaches and the performance coaches as well, returning them back to the sport component. And you got to understand, from day 1 to day 90 minute of playing a game is a game usually about a 10 to 14 day process. Nobody likes to hear me say that, but if you don't want to be back in the clinic and back on the table or back in the training room, you really have to have this process of understanding the phases of treatment. Now, again, you've got to be honest with you. If you got a tweak or a tightness in your hamstring and you're going to keep playing through it, well, you're going to end up straining it and be with us for 6 weeks and go through the process. But if you feel that tightness and you think if something's going on, get in the office earlier. Maybe it's only 4 or 5 days you miss because we get the flexibility. We get you feeling good with zero tightness, zero pain. So maybe you gave up 3 to 4 days instead of having to give up 4 to 6 weeks. So you got to really get to know your body. And coaches and performance coaches and parents, talk to your athletes. How do you feel? Do you have any soreness or pain? Yeah, well, I got a little soreness in my hamstring. All right, is it a 2 out of 10? Let's get some flexibility. Let's get some range of motion. How do you feel now? I feel great. All right, well, maybe you beat the component of training that muscle. It's all about communication.
Yeah, perfect. It's great advice, and it's something I think just to kind of echo and maybe speak directly to the players, that it's significantly different, the feeling or the pain associated just with day-to-day movements as opposed to obviously soccer specific or sport specific movements. And that's normally where, when you say you feel fine because it's a very moderate degree of strain or pressure that you're putting on the associated muscle part, or body part. And understanding that then 90 minutes or 60 minutes of soccer and lots of different changes of directions and high intensity, that the response is very different, and your coaches are just trying to look after you. So John, we said this was going to be a shorter one, being conscious of the fact that you're a very busy man and your time is very much in demand. So it's flown past, and I greatly appreciate the insight that you've shared. I think just for players, it's important to just kind of try and close. You've obviously spoken about conditioning and flexibility, strength, hydration, nutrition. The things that they can be doing right now, the little things, the core exercises that day to day will help prepare them as best as possibly can for the return, so that they ultimately aren't coming in straight back into Jaguar physical therapy centers. We would like to wherever possible, no matter where you're listening from, obviously avoid being undergoing a medical exam, back in the first week of returning to the field. So John, just let me ask, for the benefit of people who might want a little bit more insight from you, where could they find you? You've mentioned the book.
The easiest way to find us is either through jag1pt.com, or if anybody has specific questions that they want to ask me directly, it's info@jag1pt.com, and it's JAGONEPT.com. And as Tom and Mark know, I'm 24/7. I'm pretty accessible. My team makes sure that we get back in touch with people, and anything you guys need, we're here to help.
Perfect. Well, John, on behalf of myself and Willow, all of Team Beyond Pulse, and the players, parents, and coaches listening now, thank you ever so much for sharing your insight and your time with us today. And we greatly appreciate it. And to the parents, players, coaches listening, again, thank you for being here. Tomorrow, players, we're fortunate to be joined by Mr. Matt Briggs, who's over in Real Salt Lake as their head of scouting. So he's going to speak about how you can turn your strengths into super strengths and stand out from a crowd as you look to get selected into teams across every level of soccer. So thank you everybody for choosing BP as your daily dose of education, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thanks again, John.
Thank you. Be well.